than 1,000 years ago, one of the most enduring legends of all time sprang from the sifting sands of Arabia. It told of a mighty sultan who was so angered at what he perceived to be the infidelity of women that each day he would take a new bride, spend the honeymoon night with her, then have her slain the next morning. The cycle of marriage and murder would terrorize the kingdom until the advent of one extraordinary young woman. Her name was Scheherazade. Taming her bloodthirsty husband through her unique gift of storytelling, she enthralled him with tales of wondrous exploits for 1,001 captivating nights. Thus was handed down a collection of stories long cherished as perennial favorites throughout the Western world. Included among them are the beloved characters of Aladdin, Ali Baba, and Sinbad the Sailor, replete with dazzling supporting casts of supernatural beings and terrifying monsters. Is there any possibility that the tales were based on actual events? Were descriptions of flying carpets and magic lamps mere figments of Scheherazade's fertile imagination, or perhaps rooted in a reality we have yet to understand? And did a beautiful woman by the name of Scheherazade exist at all? Journey with us into an era long veiled in mystery as we enter the fabled world of the Arabian Nights. Arabia, a vast stretch of land bridging Europe, Asia, and Africa, eternally isolated by a surrounding sea of sand. As late as the 18th century, little was known in the West of this exotic region until the appearance of a remarkable book called The 1,001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights Entertainments. It was published in Paris in 1704. A translation of an ancient Arabic text, it became one of the best-selling books of the time. Within months of its appearance, its popularity rivaled that of even the Bible. The stories opened a portal into the fabled world of the Middle East 1,000 years earlier. This was a time of wealthy and powerful rulers, a time of magnificent palaces, of desert fortresses, kasbahs, and harems, a time when Arabic culture dominated vast areas of the ancient world.
We're looking at a period which is at astonishing intellectual brilliance, a period when science is moving forward rapidly in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, optics. Almost every field that we think of as science and medicine today are moving forward at a very rapid pace. And we're also talking about a culture which is extremely literate, which is producing an enormous number of books.
The opening pages of the Arabian Nights tell of a mythical king or sultan who was so angered to discover that his wife had been unfaithful to him that he had her put to death. Fearing further sexual betrayals by any of his future wives, the Sultan decided to marry a virgin each day, take his new bride to bed, and then have her beheaded the following morning.
We only have to look at our own history. We know that King Henry VIII did away with, like, how many wives was it? 8, however many concubines besides that. And that was one of the kings of England in what's very close to the modern era.
For years, the carnage of marriage and murder continued. Eventually, few eligible young maidens remained alive in the Sultan's kingdom. The nation's highest government official, the vizier, could no longer find any women to take the deadly marriage vows with the Sultan. All had already succumbed to his bloody decree. All, that is, except one. She was the vizier's own beloved daughter, a beautiful young woman by the name of Scheherazade. With no choice but to remain loyal to his sultan, the vizier reluctantly introduces Scheherazade to him. The sultan willingly accepts his lovely new bride, sealing her fate. It is here that the Arabian Nights surprises its readers with the first of many unexpected turns. For the text reveals that Scheherazade devises a plan that may save her life. After hours of passionate lovemaking, Scheherazade playfully asks the Sultan if he would like to hear a story. Always ready for a little diversionary entertainment, he agrees. And so, Scheherazade begins to weave her spell. She starts to tell him a fable of high adventure and intrigue. By sunrise, the Sultan is still engrossed in the tale. Scheherazade has captured his unremitting attention. Clearly, she is a uniquely gifted storyteller. But with the dawn must come her fate. In accordance with the Sultan's decree, she must now die. Yet it is at this crucial point that Scheherazade surprisingly breaks the cruel cycle of enforced capital punishment. By not quite finishing her story, she leaves the Sultan begging for more. But royal duties call. He cannot hear the rest of her adventurous yarn now. The sentence will be postponed. Tonight, she must conclude her tale. That evening, when Scheherazade finishes her story, she immediately begins another, drawing on characters from the original plot. Amazingly, her royal husband again spares her life, so that he may hear the continuation of the tale on the following night. The clever device of having one story grow out of the previous one continues for an uncanny 1001 nights. Eventually, the Sultan abolishes the law, calling for the death of his wife. It is a phenomenal accomplishment, assuring Scheherazade of her life and finally freeing the nation from the terrible decree. For this, the name of Scheherazade would echo through the centuries.
It would take a woman of extraordinary abilities to heal this man of his murderous sentiments and his distrust of women. So it may be that Scheherazade's story is a tribute to all of the women who have found ways behind the scenes to get more power and more safety than their culture actually had assigned to them in the first place.
Through Scheherazade, the Western world was introduced to some of the best-loved adventure stories of all time. Many have become classics and are as popular now as when they were first told. Set in locations as diverse as India, Egypt, China, Persia, and Africa, the tales in the Arabian Nights contain a rich assortment of larger-than-life characters who often struggle against immense odds. Mythological beasts and monsters, supernatural beings, and magical objects. Feats of great courage are peppered throughout the stories. Many of them have a moral underpinning containing a profound message of hope. The tales may have originally been intended for use by professional storytellers in the village bazaar or marketplace throughout the early Arab-speaking world.
For people in medieval, Islamic countries, the things that they would like to hear about are the same as for us. They are the fantastic, the exotic, something which is different from their own daily lives. And it even helps if some of the central characters are characters that are recognizable to them from their daily lives, and yet get wrapped up in a world of marvels and fabulous events that can, in some sense, lead us out of our lives, our daily grind, and entertain us.
But who was Scheherazade, the extraordinary woman of whom so little is known? Was she merely the daughter of a sultan's vizier who lived in some long-forgotten corner of Arabia over 1,000 years ago? Or, as some believe, was she herself as fictitious as the characters she described in her stories?
Well, I'd love to think there was a Scheherazade. If there hadn't been one, we'd have to invent her. I think in some ways she's a representation of all of the women storytellers whose names we've never heard. We often say that Anonymous was a woman. But in fact, the ancient world has traditions of women storytellers. So Scheherazade is simply the latest in a long line of skilled women performers.
We may never know the answer to the riddle of Scheherazade's true identity. But if she was merely another character conjured up by the real author of the Arabian Nights, who was responsible for the stories? And where did the ideas come from? Did the original writer possess one of history's most imaginative minds, or were the tales based on real events from a long-gone era? The Arabian Nights tells us that the young bride, Scheherazade, enthralls her royal husband, the Sultan, for 1,001 nights with her remarkable talent as a storyteller. Yet scholars now believe that the Arabian Nights did not stem from one source, but from many. However, someone must have compiled the stories. Whoever it was is believed to have lived in Baghdad around the 8th or 9th centuries.
The reason there's no authorship specifically to the Arabian Nights is because they are ancient stories. They are ones which are set down from various different collections. Also, a great many of the tales were written in different courts. Some were Persian stories, some were Chinese stories, some were Arabic or North African, or even a few European stories shuffled their way on in, and people rewrote them to the local taste.
One of the easiest ways to understand the compilation of the Arabian Nights is simply to follow the trade routes. We know that the trade routes went to India. We know they went down into Persia. We know they went up into Syria and Turkey and over to Egypt. So there's a lot of cross-breeding of cultural motifs going on. People tend to tell the same stories over and over, sometimes changing the name and some details, but the patterns remain the same.
Whatever their mysterious origin, the stories that have journeyed down to us through the centuries have firmly established themselves as some of the best loved tales in literature. Perhaps none more so than the story of Aladdin and his magic lamp. Set in China, it tells of a poor tailor who meets an evil sorcerer. The sorcerer tricks Aladdin into venturing deep into a dangerous cave where he is to retrieve a brass lamp. But this is no ordinary lamp. It has magical properties and contains a genie, or a supernatural being with the power to make any wish come true. Aladdin disappoints the sorcerer by keeping the lamp for himself and escaping from the cave. Aided by the genie, he acquires great wealth. He marries the local sultan's daughter and commands the genie to construct a wondrous palace for him. But the wicked sorcerer tracks Aladdin down. Disguised as an itinerant trader, the sorcerer recovers the magic lamp by offering new lamps for old. He commands the genie to banish Aladdin's princess wife and her palace to Africa. But Aladdin pursues the sorcerer, regains the lamp, and re-establishes his palace and his wife back in China. There he prospers and lives a full and happy life. One of the most alluring elements in the adventure is undoubtedly that of the magic lamp. Could it perhaps have served some sort of symbolic purpose in the story?
For ancient people who live without streetlights, who are dependent on the moon for their light at night, a lamp is a symbol of deliverance from darkness. It's a primary symbol of technology. It is, in fact, a helper. It helps you see where you're going. It helps you know where you are. So a lamp makes a perfect magical object.
Aladdin took the lamp and rubbed it gently on its side. Once more the genie of the lamp magically appeared, saying, "What wouldst thou command of me, O master? I am ready to obey thee as thy slave and servant." The story of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp.
Far more wondrous than the lamp itself was the jinn, or genie, who lived within it. What was the origin of this unearthly being? Could it have been based on ancient legend, or even on religious belief?
Within the Judeo-Christian tradition, of course, we find that there are angels and there are devils. And in the Islamic tradition, there are not only the ranks of angels and the ranks of devils that existed in the earlier Judeo-Christian tradition, but also the jinn, or what we say in English, the genies.
The Quran, the holy book of Islam, makes direct reference to the jinn.
We created man from clay, from mud molded into shape, and the jinn race we created from fire and from scorching wind. The Holy Quran, Surah 15, verse 27.
With the genie's help, Aladdin rises to the pinnacle of success. The story contains a profound moral message, perhaps aimed at an audience once living in submission to a harsh ruler.
In traditional societies, or in societies that have a rigid social ranking, you need a kind of rags to riches tale to give people hope, because there simply wasn't much room for self-betterment. And this is the whole point of a folk tale. It's to take you from your original state, to take you through many adventures, to bring you back to where you become the head of your own family, and now you have some wisdom about the ways of the world.
The story of Aladdin has firmly embedded itself in Western literary tradition. But it is only one of many cherished tales attributed to Scheherazade. Of all the tales contained in the Arabian Nights, one of the most popular continues to be that of the intrepid sailor known as Sinbad. The story tells of a daring young merchant from Baghdad who undertakes 7 ocean voyages that embroil him in various adventures and expose him to great danger. His travels take him thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean to destinations as diverse as China and Africa. On his first voyage, Sinbad mistakes the back of a large whale for an island. Leaving the ship to frolic on it, he is marooned at sea when the whale dives underwater. On his second and fifth voyages, he encounters giant birds known as rocks, one of which carries him from a valley littered with diamonds and infested by huge man-eating serpents. Always returning home safely, yet always thirsting for more hazardous exploits, Sinbad eventually settled down in Baghdad, but only after he has undertaken the journey to Serendib, or the island known today as Sri Lanka. There he is sold into slavery and observes herds of terrifying wild animals. Though an obvious work of fiction, moments of the Sinbad stories seem to ring true. Were these escapades of adventurous daring-do perhaps partly based on fact?
Of all the tales in the 1001 Nights, probably the adventures of Sinbad the Sailor are most closely rooted in real experience by real individuals. I mean, these sailors saw many spectacular things, the types of things that anybody would marvel at, and in bringing them back home 2 years later after a long voyage, of course, and retelling them to families in Iraq or in Oman or in the Arabian Peninsula, of course, they would grow quite naturally in the telling as they spread through society.
The rhinoceros fought the elephant and ran its horn into the elephant's belly, then carried it off upon his head. But the blood and fat of the elephant ran into the eyes of the rhinoceros, making him blind, and he fell to the ground. Then, from out of the sky, came the roc, the giant bird, which carried off both beasts in her claws as food for her young. The second voyage of Sinbad the Sailor.
Could such far-fetched descriptions of elephants and rhinos have been based on actual events? And what of the roc, the giant bird that in one mighty swoop could carry off the carcasses of two of the largest land mammals on Earth?
If you look at the Indian Ocean, it really wasn't that far away from New Guinea and New Zealand, and until recently, we still have the skeletons. There was the giant moa there, which was, not able to fly and couldn't carry off elephants, but could certainly kill a man and was big enough for that. And they were around, living at the time that the Arabian Nights were written. So if a traveler to those far lands had blown off course, gotten to the island where, these giant birds were running around, well, goes back and says, yes, and there were the giant birds that were big enough to eat a man. Well, not quite eat a man, but certainly kill him. Later on, other storytellers get a hold of it and going, wouldn't the bird be more impressive if it carried off an elephant in its claws? Good, we're going to put that. Suddenly they get more coins thrown into the basket in the marketplace.
In addition to stories brought back to the village marketplace by sailors and merchants, many tales came to Arabia by way of the great trade route known as the Silk Road. This 2,500-mile-long economic highway, established to carry Chinese silk deep into the heart of the once mighty Roman Empire, linked Europe and Asia for centuries. 1,000 years ago, as commerce increased between the two continents, many merchants made use of it, though it was a grueling journey, often requiring months to complete.
The Silk Route went throughout the ancient world, and there were the caravanserais, where people stopped for the night and closed the doors against desert storms that came by. And sometimes people were trapped there for a few days, which, if you've ever been stranded while traveling, gets very boring, or even when you stop for the night. And so, of course, you're going to do storytelling. Stories were a way to pass the time when there was nothing else to do. So a tale that was told in China would be carried along to Damascus. A tale that was told in Damascus could easily be taken along up into Europe, into Italy, or into North Africa. Travelers go everywhere, and if it's a good story, people will tell it again and again and again.
Like so many of the tales in the Arabian Nights, the saga of Sinbad the Sailor was probably carried across oceans and centuries until the book's original compiler added it to the collection of stories. Today, it remains one of the best-known adventures in the book. 1,000 years ago, Baghdad was the undisputed cultural and economic center of the Muslim world. This was a time of splendor, of kings and courtiers, with their entourages of wives and concubines, living elegant lifestyles in magnificent palaces. It was also a time of bitter feuds and rivalries between royal households. Not far beyond the opulence and luxury lay the constant threat of battle. The common man and woman were often helplessly swept up in the tide of war. This was the turbulent background that spawned many of the tales in the Arabian Nights.
People certainly did live through times where, empires clashed and your country could be ruled by one empire one day and then another empire another, or that the person who is ruling today might be toppled or executed by another figure or a superior and simply be gone tomorrow. So there are all sorts of things that are happening in the world. Elements in the folktale are part of the way societies come to grips with that.
One of the functions of the Arabian Nights may have been to help people cope with the uncertainties of the time. The means to escape hardship has universal appeal. Even now, the flying carpet, one of the most mysterious motifs in many of the stories, may have provided the source.
But why is this carpet so exorbitantly expensive? Inquired Prince Hussein of the merchant. Ah, good sir, replied the merchant, this is no ordinary carpet. Whoever possesses it and sits on it may be transported in an instant wherever he desires to be, without hindrance or obstacle. The story of Prince Ahmed.
One of the things we often see in folklore is the notion of magical transference, the idea of traveling quickly. Because for traditional peoples, travel is hard and difficult. I mean, you're very lucky if you have a camel or a donkey. So getting anywhere rapidly seems to them to be miraculous. So probably the magic carpet motif takes an everyday item that people walked on, they know it, they're familiar with it, and yet they imbue it with the magical ability to take you quickly wherever your heart desires. This must have seemed wondrous to ancient people. So the flying carpet may serve a real yearning of the human spirit, both for travel and for freedom from a rigid socio-economic ranked society that didn't give people very much leeway in which to live their lives.
Magic was an integral component in all of the stories of the Arabian Nights. The third of the most famous adventures in the book is that of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Set in Persia, the story tells of Ali Baba and his brother Qasim. One day, they secretly observed 40 thieves gaining entry to a hidden cave. Its mouth is revealed when the thieves call out the magic words, "Open Sesame." Later, Ali Baba returns on his own to the site, utters the password, and enters the cave, only to discover that it is full of stolen treasure. He mistakenly tells his brother about it, who goes to the cave, calls out "Open Sesame," enters it, and then forgets the password. He is trapped within. When the thieves return, they find him and kill him. Ali Baba later discovers his brother's body in the cave and brings it back to town for burial. There, the thieves discover where Ali Baba lives. Intent on murdering him in order to preserve the secret whereabouts of their cave, they disguise themselves and visit Ali Baba at his house. But his faithful servant discovers their identity and kills them with boiling oil. Spared from death, Ali Baba uses the treasure from the cave to ensure a long and comfortable life for himself, his family, and his servants. As in many of the stories, in the end, crime does not pay, good triumphs over evil.
The stories are filled with symbols and metaphors, and particularly in an oral culture, and a culture where knowledge is really being transmitted from generation to generation, and morals and ethics are being inculcated in young people in the form of stories. It's those symbols and metaphors that resonate and give us the deeper meanings of the story.
For all its moral values, the Arabian Nights remains an enigma. Though attributed to the Sultan's young bride known to us only as Scheherazade, she too is really little more than another character in the book. Who then compiled the stories as we know them today? For countless centuries now, the world has enjoyed the stories that were supposedly told by the young bride Scheherazade to her husband, the Sultan. For 1,001 nights, she spun tale after tale in order to save her life from a decree that would have sent her to her death. We may never know whether there was a single compiler of the Arabian Nights, or whether the stories were simply culled from legends and folk tales accumulated throughout Asia and the Middle East. But one thing is certain: somebody, somewhere, gathered the stories and wove them together as a single manuscript. Whoever that was may forever remain a mystery. But at the beginning of the 18th century, the Arabian Nights made its first appearance in Western Europe. The place was Paris. Anton Galland was a student of classical and Middle Eastern languages. He had spent some time working as an interpreter for the French government in Ottoman Turkey. There, he developed an interest in Muslim culture. On his return to France, Galland purchased a 13th century Arabic manuscript from a dealer in Syria. Its author was unknown, but the work was entitled The 1,001 Nights. To this day, it remains the oldest known version of the Arabian Nights collection. Recognizing the unique literary value of the 4-volume set, Galland immediately set about translating the texts. But scholars often wonder whether these were the only documents he worked from.
At one point in his journal, he writes that he is busy translating the 4 volumes of the 1,001 Nights. But in a personal letter to a friend, he mentions the fact that he's writing a translation of the 5 volumes of the 1,001 Nights that have just reached him from the Ottoman Empire. And then finally, when he dies, among his personal effects, we find only 3 volumes. And so one of the great mysteries of the 1001 Nights is whether there were other volumes of the 1001 Nights that Galland was working from that we have never uncovered.
With the appearance of Anton Galland's translation, the public fell in love with the stories, though Aladdin, Sinbad, and Ali Baba were still not among them. However, the publishers were soon demanding that Galland provide more material for an expanded version of the book. And it is then that a mysterious character entered Galland's life, a character who would greatly influence the Arabian Nights.
This is a Maronite priest from Syria named Hannah Diab, who is visiting Paris and who Antoine Galland meets at dinner parties in the houses of French noblemen. And at these evening gatherings, Hannah Diab finds that he can be very entertaining and the center of attention by telling versions of Arabic folk tales as dinner conversation. Now, Galland had heard a number of these tales at parties that he had attended, and we know this because he scribbled them into his diary. And it's among these stories that we find the most famous tales from the 1001 Nights, the story of Aladdin and the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. The tales of Sinbad the Sailor, which had never been part of the collection before.
And so it was that 3 unrelated tales have become the best remembered and most popular of all the stories in the Arabian Nights. While the Syrian texts used by Anton Galland were the oldest ever found, other manuscripts of the Arabian Nights were later discovered in Egypt. Also of unknown origin, they were of more recent vintage, yet in many ways similar to the earlier Syrian texts. Various translators worked from them, and a number of English versions of the stories eventually appeared. But of all the English translations, none became as famous nor as contentious as that published by Sir Richard Burton. Already a flamboyant social figure in Victorian England, Burton was renowned as a travel writer and explorer. He had made a name for himself by seeking out the source of the River Nile in Africa. He had visited India and Arabia, and had written extensively about them. He had been appointed British consul in Italy, Brazil, and Syria, became a formidable linguist, and was fluent in Arabic. Regarding himself as an expert in human sexual behavior, he had already published English versions of the ancient Oriental erotic texts, the Kama Sutra, and the Perfumed Garden. In the early 1880s, he decided to turn his attention to translating the Arabian Nights into English. For a time, this would become the most popular of all the early English versions. But it was not without controversy.
Basically, Burton took the opportunity to eroticize the text in any way possible. And he added detailed descriptions to anything that might have been simply a romantic encounter, leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination. In essence, Richard Burton took the 1001 Nights and turned it into a piece of Victorian pornography. And it was very popular.
In time, the story of Scheherazade and the Arabian Nights would become one of the best loved of all literary works throughout Europe. Even today, in its native Middle East, or wherever stories are told, the essence of the tales still remains popular.
The reason that the Arabian Nights and the full cycle of the tales have remained so popular throughout time is they're very good stories. They have all of the wonders in them which the storytellers could weave in, that they could embroider. Every mystery, every fabulous thing that people heard of was put into these tales. They are filled with time-tested symbols of wonder, which everyone, upon hearing the first time, will open their mouth and just breathe out. It's just amazing.
A fragile, ancient Arabic manuscript. A mysterious teller of tales in a Parisian salon. By such slender paths are we connected to a vanished world of wonders. The tales of the Arabian Nights, stories that continue to entrance and enthrall audiences everywhere.